welcome to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. This episode is part of our Free Expression Friday series, an interview series from ABA's American Booksellers for Free Expression, celebrating the amazing work of booksellers, organizers, and book people in general, fighting for the right to read. For this week's edition of Free Expression Friday, we're dropping in a new podcast episode from our friends at Libro.fm, which features ABA's very own Philomena. In this episode, Philomena discusses the Right to Read Handbook, available now at your local independent bookstore, as well as book bans, censorship, and the role of bookstores as spaces for activism. You can subscribe to Libro.fm on your favorite podcast app to follow along with their monthly series of interviews and conversations with authors, narrators, and book lovers. Enjoy!
Libro.fm podcast with Craig and Karen supporting local bookstores, audiobooks, and more. Join the world of stories. As always, thank you for listening.
Hi, and welcome to the Libro FM podcast, where we talk to authors, narrators, booksellers, and more. I'm Craig.
And I'm Karen. In today's episode, we have a great conversation with Philomena Polefrone, who is the Advocacy Associate Manager at the American Bookseller Association. This episode is coming out in time for Banned Books Week, which Philomena, I would say, is the perfect person to talk to. She is incredibly knowledgeable about this topic and has an exciting new release that we'll be discussing.
First off, this is our third Banned Books Week episode, which means that we've been doing this podcast for quite a while. So I just want to shout that out. Happy third Banned Books Week episode.
That's wild.
I know.
Okay, here we are. I guess we have a podcast.
Yes. This interview was so fun. Philomena is so intelligent and eloquent, and we learned so much about all the ABA's work they're doing and kind of how Philomena came into this role. So I hope everyone really enjoys this one.
And as always, if you're interested in sticking around afterwards, Craig and I will talk about what we are currently reading and enjoying.
Hello, everyone. Today we are here with Philomena Polefrone, who is on the advocacy team at the ABA, which, if you don't know, is the American Bookseller Association. Philomena, for folks who may not know you, we'd love if you could introduce yourself to our listeners and share anything you'd like us to know about what you're up to in the book world.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So I'm Philomena. I am a Brooklyn-based intellectual freedom advocate, and the majority of that work I do through American Booksellers for Free Expression, which is the name for ABA's Freedom of Expression initiative. So yeah, that's that. I'm coming from a book background in terms of I'm a former bookseller. I spent about a decade in academia teaching literature and political philosophy. And so that's kind of the experience that I'm bringing to this, and the approach that I'm bringing to it is literature and activism. They're inherently connected. And in this case, the literature is the subject of the activism as well as the vehicle for it.
So beautifully stated. Thank you.
I like when you introduce yourself, you're like, I'm fighting for advocacy for books in Brooklyn. I was like, that's the coolest way to introduce yourself ever. I'm like, I'm an app designer. Like,
oh yeah. I mean, to be fair, that's like half of Brooklyn or fighting the fight for something.
Yeah.
Well, Philomena, we have tons of questions about your work specifically and banned books, but to kind of center the conversation for any of our listeners who aren't as familiar with the ABA, we were wondering if you could talk a little bit about who the American Bookseller Association is and kind of, how you found yourself working there.
Yeah, so the American Booksellers Association has been around since 1900, and we have been the trade association for independent booksellers since then. We have over 2,000 company members with over 2,500 locations.
Wow.
And so that's all over the country. And our stores are community spaces as much as they are businesses. A lot of people refer to their local bookstore as the third space that's neither work nor home, that they go to hang out. And that's actually a huge part of our power in terms of free expression advocacy too, because it's a place where conversations happen. And we have so many stores across the country that if we can kind of get organized and start spreading the word about what is happening to books in public libraries and schools and school libraries and in our stores, then that's potentially pretty powerful.
That's so amazing to know the scope of it. I didn't realize the ABA had been around since 1900 too. That blows my mind.
Yeah, somewhere we just donated all of our archives to the Columbia University archives, and so I got to see some of these old pictures from the old institutes where it was just like, I don't know, it looked like it was the deck of the Titanic or something. Everyone's just in tuxedos.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, I'm glad the ABA lasted longer than the Titanic.
Brutal.
Too soon.
Still too soon. Always too soon.
You mentioned the freedom of expression group that you specifically work with, and I was wondering if you could share an overview of, how the ABA and the sub organizations, the sub teams are working specifically with the bookstores when it comes to fighting book bans.
Yeah, so ABFI was created in 1990, which, well, two facts about that. One, I was created in the same year, so that's is meant to be. Two, 1990 was just after the book ban crisis of the 80s, which had some similarities, but was a little bit different. It was, a lot of people think about Judy Blume, Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret, and so many other wonderful books in terms of what was targeted then. But we can get into the whole sort of history of the culture war at another moment. But so ABFI came out of that. It actually used to be ABFFE. It was the American Booksellers Foundation for Free Expression.
Okay.
And it was an independent organization that then became subsumed into the American Booksellers Association in the aughts at some point. And so now ABFI is a major one of, I should say, of the advocacy priorities of the American Booksellers Association. There's only, 4 of us on the advocacy team, but there's only 2 of us who are only on the advocacy team. So it's me and Dave Grogan, who's the director of ABFI and also does a ton of incredible work in terms of small business advocacy.
Thank you for the history there. And speaking of history, we want to know a little bit about your history. You mentioned it at the top a little bit, but you worked at a bookstore and then you were teaching and now you're here. I would love to hear how that kind of journey happened and if your experience as a bookseller or teacher kind of experiences sort of influences what you're doing now.
I was a bookseller at Greenlight Bookstore in Brooklyn. Incredible store. I was just out of college and knew I loved books and didn't know a whole lot more about what to do about that. And, Greenlight was a really incredible place to land for a little bit. I ended up briefly at Publishers Weekly and then did a PhD in English and comparative literature at Columbia. And I was, broadly speaking, while I was there, I was researching literature and activism and the connection between those two things. Literature as activism, how literature, especially in the early 20th century, commented on some of the environmental activism of its time. And in my last 4 years at Columbia, I was there for about a decade in total. After I'd finished my degree, I started teaching a class that was basically the greatest hits of Western political philosophy. So, starting with the Republic and then going all the way through Saidiya Hartman and Michel Foucault and so many modern classics. And as I was teaching that class, I didn't know it, but I was kind of creating the intellectual foundation for what I would be doing now, which is understanding some of the philosophy of free expression and free speech that has informed the U.S. First Amendment, and which in turn informs the basis for defending books from being attacked in court. So, for example, when someone wants to shut down Genderqueer by Maia Kobabe, or so many other books, and Tango makes 3, the gay penguin book that they're still not over. I'm sorry to report, right? When someone wants to shut one of those things down on the basis that they're dangerous, or wants to shut down the 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah-Jones because it contains divisive concepts, you need a way to make the legal and kind of ethical argument that that book must be allowed to exist, that information must be allowed to circulate. One way that I came to understand that argument was that part of the way that progress happens is by ideas being allowed to circulate that some people have a really hard time with. And that actually it's the discussion of those ideas and it's the sort of cultural process of coming to understand them that lets people not only understand different ways that things could be, but actually to kind of come to understand their own thoughts and opinions better. So all of these, those discussions that come out of it, even when they're difficult for everybody, are so essential. This sounds like kind of cringe because I feel like everyone's saying it these days, but are so essential to American democracy, like actually.
Yeah.
I see the tip of the iceberg, I think, as an individual when it comes to what's happening with book bans. And, I know there's tons of stuff happening online constantly, and you see much more of it than I certainly do. And I was wondering if you could share some of the common challenges that are popping up lately. What are the big rocks, the big boulders that we're facing when it comes to how these book bans are going down today?
Yeah, there's so many ways to answer that question because unfortunately there are a ton of challenges and there are a ton of, mines in that minefield. But one of the challenges is that some of the grassroots, quote unquote, they're actually frequently quite well funded. But a lot of the groups that have been trying to ban books they got a jump on us really in 2021. A lot of people were not used to paying attention to their school board because they were boring. School boards should be boring. It should be about allocation of resources, right? But because no one was paying attention, groups like Moms for Liberty were able to identify an opportunity to shut down books and ideas that they didn't agree with, including COVID precautions. Actually, that's a lot of where it started, is with COVID precautions. And the fact that maybe they didn't agree with or like some of the books that their kids had access to at school. And so because they noticed this, they organized and frequently got their people on school boards before anyone could even notice. And to some extent, in the 3 years since then, everyone else has been playing catch up. People noticed all of a sudden that crazy things were happening at their school board, but it took time for them to find the other people who agreed with them and to organize against it. And once people get organized, very frequently they're able to throw out the bad school board and replace it with people who want school boards to be functional and boring again. But that has been one of the challenges, is just playing catch up, doing the fundraising, getting information to the people who need it, and so forth. I think that, but there's also a lot of clarity needed in some of the principles that determine who gets to decide which books are in which library. Okay. Legally, it's the difference between the legal definition of obscenity, which is something that has been worked out through a series of Supreme Court cases and in the ABA Right to Read Handbook, I go actually through the series of Supreme Court cases that created the legal definition of obscenity as it exists today. But it's the gap between obscenity and what is considered legally harmful to minors, which is a different standard, because there are things that are not legally obscene, but that may not still be the best thing for a 6-year-old to access, right? Things with some kind of violence, or things that, have a lot of sex in them, but like are also doing a lot of other things. And so those are reasonable conversations to be had, right? But the problem is the comparative ambiguity in the definition of what's harmful to minors has been something that book banners have been able to exploit for ideological reasons. So one, they've been able to redefine it, in some cases, redefine the definition of obscenity to include any reference to homosexuality, any non-heterosexuality, and being transgender. So I mentioned And Tango Makes Three, the gay penguins kids book. That is something that is being challenged because of sexual content. I don't know if you've read And Tango Makes Three.
I haven't, no.
The penguins, well, let me spoil it for you. The penguins do not have sex in that book.
I assumed not.
Right? And yet, suddenly we're meant to believe that it's has sexual content in it. And I would say the other way that that has been exploited is selectively targeting sexual content in books that they don't like for other reasons. Former English professor, anytime a book by Toni Morrison gets banned, some part of me dies. To say that those books do not have any educational or literary or artistic merit, which is what you have to do to call something legally obscene, is preposterous. So in that case, the sexual content is targeted, but that is not why it's being targeted. It's being targeted because Toni Morrison is also one of the great American novelists about anything, and especially about race.
How does that fly? Like to use your penguin example, like if there's not sex in the book, like how are they taking it off the shelves because they are saying they're like, isn't it relatively simple to disprove that?
It is, but it's simple to make the point. It is much more complicated to force the school to get the books back on the shelf.
Sure.
So in some cases, look at Florida, where a law will be passed defining any LGBTQ plus content as sexual. It has taken many, many lawsuits to get parts of that law enjoined. Those lawsuits are still ongoing. In Iowa, same thing, right? It's actually they can pass a law that is unconstitutional, but it's going to take a judge weighing in to get that law off the books and to get the books back on the shelves.
Yeah, I just saw an article in Florida that they're starting to put some books back on shelves in certain schools because of that huge lawsuit from all the big publishers. So
yeah, they are. And then but even once they make that decision, in some cases, if the books have been thrown away, though they don't have the budget to buy those books, that can be tied up in that process. So one of the things that I'm working on right now is something called the Set Books Free Project that's going to be announced during Banned Books Week this year. And it's a pipeline of banned and diverse books from independent bookstores and their customers to high ban areas to help with exactly that process, right? Okay, maybe these books are banned in your area and you don't have money to go to the bookstore and get it for yourself or for your kids. Well, we're going to try to pair up with a grassroots organization in that area to get the books out there. Or let's say in Alachua County in Florida, which is where Gainesville is, we're partnered with the Lynx Watch, which is a 501c3 attached to the Lynx, a bookstore owned by author Lauren Groff. Because Alachua County is, as I understand it, ready to get some books back on shelves, but they need the books before they can put them back on the shelf, right? So that's a way that we're trying to help with that part, is to let bookstores customers buy books for donation.
God, I love it. Show me
so
the donation
exciting.
form.
Yeah, well,
Take over
hopefully it'll get to, because so many bookstores are already doing this work. But what I'm trying to do is to just lower the barrier to entry a little bit for the stores who don't have a program like that yet, just by connecting them with grassroots organizations, by giving resources to help them know how to do it and things like that.
I love this example, this program so much. And you also mentioned that when people do get organized, they are oftentimes successful, and throwing out bad school boards and things like that. So I was wondering if you have any kind of like favorite examples of groups that have gotten organized and been really successful in turning things around. Anything that we can kind of take as an example of what we can do.
Yeah, well, I'll start with the truly local examples. I'm pretty sure this was in Penridge, Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia. Was very typical situation I described before, where these book banners got the jump on the rest of the community, got their people in the school board, banned a bunch of books. Parents in the area looked up one day to see this had happened and said, "What? No, this will not do." And so they organized throughout the whole school board. And then this actually happened in a few places. In some of the incoming school board members were sworn in on a stack of banned books, which is just incredible. It's you file it under thing you love to see. It's just it's perfect. So that's the kind of local example that we've seen. But there have also been a number of incredible groups on the state level. Annie's Foundation in Iowa, the Florida Freedom to Read Project, the Texas Freedom to Read Project, Read Freely Alabama. The list goes on. They're just these state organizations that have realized that, they start in their own community doing this work, and then they hear of other people in other nearby communities who are doing the same work in their school boards. By the way, the people that they're pushing back against are all singing from the same hymn sheet. They have the same arguments. They have the same tactics. They show up at school boards and read obscene passages that are misleading because they're taken out of context, and in some cases may not even be in the school library where they're claiming it is. And so they get together and they form these state organizations that can become incredibly influential. All of those organizations I named are doing amazing work. But then on the national level too, I want to shout out Red Wine and Blue. That's Red Wine and Blue. Their mission is basically to mobilize suburban women who are not moms for liberty to have a say in their school board. And they've actually been incredible in gearing up for the national election as well. So they have chapters all over the country, and there are a ton of organizations like that sprang up in response to the moment that did not exist before this. And the thing that makes me really optimistic, because I am actually, despite all of the horrible things I look at all day, I am actually an optimist, and I'm an optimist about this, because after the 80s, we got Banned Books Week, we got AMFI, we got so many of these organizations that have been ready to come into action when we got into this next moment. I look at the structures that are being created right now in response to this moment, and they're not going to go away. They're going to be there to make sure that it doesn't happen again. So we have a lot of work to do before we get to that point, but that makes me pretty optimistic.
You mentioned it at the beginning a little bit. I think you wedged it in one of your answers, but this is a big couple of days for you. The Right to Read handbook just came out. So tell us all about it.
Yes, it's called the ABA Right to Read Handbook, Fighting Book Bans and Why It Matters. And, I essentially created this book because I needed it, because I was looking for something to point booksellers to when their customers are coming in, seeing their banned books displays and saying, well, what can I do about it? And booksellers, they have their own local resources, but I really wanted them to have a book to point their customers to. And I couldn't quite find anything that had the combination of history and interviews and pragmatic step-by-step how-to guides that I wanted. And so I was like, well, that's my work to do, I guess. And, through all of this, it's powered by booksellers, it's powered by activists and other organizations that we work with, right? I mean, so much of this work that I've been doing over the past year, because it's about a year that I've been at ABA, has just been me learning from booksellers and other activists who are doing the work. So the how-tos in many cases are things that have come from talking to people who are already doing the work. The interviews are all interviews I conducted over the course of the year, which is just kind of forwarding the experience and wisdom of the people I talk to. And the history part, because the history part is a history of the current crisis, but it's also the history kind of going back to the McCarthy era, and trying to show, actually going back further than going back to the 19th century, but trying to show how all these different censorship cases have kind of been recurrences of the same fight, have kind of been, just different strategies to try to force this puritanical way of thinking about literature and culture onto everyone else, but have also, in many cases, actually used that idea that it's about sex to enforce some other kind of political agenda. So in this case, the vilification of Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color, and the LGBTQ plus community. Sex is an excuse in many cases to push that agenda. So that was the purpose of writing the history. But I didn't want to just give people that history and say, well, we can all just sit around together feeling bad now, right? I needed to also say, and here's what you can do about it. Here are some inspiring people who have figured out ways to fight back. And here is something for anyone, whatever point you're at in terms of this advocacy, whether you're new to it, whether you're just worried about book bans showing up in your community, whether they've been there for years. I designed it hoping that it would have something for anyone, no matter what point they were in that journey.
All right, Craig, should we move into our lightning round with Philomena?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So this is a much more lighthearted portion of this podcast in which we just have some silly questions to get to know you a little bit better.
All about it.
I think, Craig, you have the first one.
Sure. What is your favorite way to waste time when you probably should be working?
Playing the guitar.
Nice. Acoustic or electric?
So it had been acoustic for about 10 years, and I barely ever played an electric. And then I played someone else's electric, and I was like, I need an electric.
And now you're just over there shredding when you should be working.
Shredding, more like, slowly tearing.
I love that.
What is your go-to shareable food item when you're required to bring something to like a party or a gathering?
That is such a good question. I mean, I always just panic and make a Caesar salad. But if I would, like, I would love if it was like, I should learn a tabbouleh or something like that. I need to level up. Thank you for the nudge.
Nice. It's better than me. I just like grab a bottle of wine on the way and be like, sorry. There you go. So.
Yeah, actually canned cocktails. That's often what I do.
Yep.
Yeah. Would you rather have to dance everywhere you go or always sing everything instead of speaking?
Dance everywhere I go. I practically do that anyway, to be honest.
Oh, that's amazing. Kay basically sings everything she speaks. So, the two of you.
Really?
It's not intentional. It just
it just comes out.
Yeah, no, I can hear it. It's very sonorous.
Thank you.
Which is appropriate for audiobook world.
So our last thing before we ask you for book recommendations, we call Instagram story time. But we're doing a quick little spin on this one because your Instagram is private. So we heard that you have a podcast that is about insects and their role in the media. Tell us about it, please.
Okay. All right. Here's the story. It's called Critterature. My main contribution to the podcast has been the name and trying to make bugs funny. I am in love with an entomologist, former entomologist. And we both love literature and she loves bugs.
Perfect.
And so yeah, we've been going through like Starship Troopers and oh my God, I'm blanking on everything else that we're talking about. You know, Metamorphosis is up next, of course. So yeah, we've been recording Them, which is about giant ants. So it's literature and movies, I should say.
I watched a movie that would be great for this podcast earlier today, and not on purpose, but I literally finished it right before we got on here. So I'm voting that The Fly makes it onto the podcast
it's on the list.
At some point.
It's on the list. Yes. Yeah. Is that a VHS tape?
Oh yeah.
It's audio medium, so people can't tell.
There's lots of VHS tapes in this office.
Oh my God. You look like you're recording from a video rental from the 80s.
Maybe I am.
Welcome to the time warp, Philomena.
Yes.
Okay, our very last question. This one is always self-serving on our part. We were wondering if you have any books that you've read recently or enjoyed recently that you want to recommend, or just any favorite recommendations that you like to make.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to theme it. I'm going to make it band books.
Perfect.
Right?
I thought you were going to say you were going to make it bugs.
No. That's for my other podcast, Greg.
True. I don't want to steal your content.
I just want to give a shout out to something that a lot of people have heard of. And I just want to make sure that people are not only hearing of it, but also reading it, which is the 1619 Project, Nicole Hannah-Jones. I was lucky enough to get to see her speak this week at ALA's Free People Read Freely Summit in DC. Like, every page of that book will blow your mind and make you realize that what you thought you knew about American history, no matter how confident you are that you know about it, it's going to show you that you actually don't. And that actually the story is pretty significantly different. And many of the stories that you think you know about American history are significantly different from what you thought. So yeah, 1619 Project. I think there's a kids version of it too, which has also been banned. And another book that I just adore, and the saving grace of doing this work is that banned books are incredible and you have an excuse to read a lot of them. And one of those is Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Malinda Lo. It's a coming of age story of a young queer woman, Chinese American woman in San Francisco in the 50s. It's just the characters are so wonderful. The interiority of that character is so fully realized. It's perfect. And actually, I truly forgot this. This is going to sound so self-serving, but because I love that book so much, I reached out to Malinda Lo's publicist and have an essay from her in the book.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
Yeah, it was really meaningful to me because she has this essay on her blog that we adapted that was sort of about what it's like to have your book banned as a queer woman, what that meant to her and what it means to all the kids who are being told that stories about people like them are not allowed.
That's such a beautiful connection that essay is in your book. I absolutely cannot wait to read it.
Well, that is the end. We have reached the end. Thank you so much for your time. I know this is a big week coming up for you, so we're glad that you could find some time to sit down with us.
Thank you for taking the time to talk to me about it. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate everything that Libro is doing. Just letting people listen to audiobooks who don't want to support, we know those ones over there.
We don't speak that word on this podcast.
I know. I don't blame you.
I would just bleep it out. Don't worry.
All right. Thank you both so much.
Thanks, Philomena. All right, we hope that gives you some great information as you head into Banned Books Week. Lots and lots of things to think about and to activate on. And to wrap this up, Craig, I would love to hear what you are currently reading and enjoying.
I am reading Catalina by Karla Cornejo Villavicencio, and it is amazing. I picked up this book because this is a spoiler, I guess, for a future episode, but we had the honor of getting to interview her like 10 minutes ago at the time of recording. So I picked it up and I was like, oh, I want to read this so I know a little bit more about the book and the author, and in love with this book. I'm about halfway through and the writing is gorgeous. The story is amazing. I cannot say enough good things about this so far. It basically tells the story of a young woman who, when she was a child, her parents were in a car crash. So she gets sent to America to go live with her grandparents in New York City. And they are undocumented. So she's dealing with a lot of kind of trauma around her family and, living in an undocumented status. And then her grandparents basically do everything for her in terms of education. And they work really, really hard to provide her with like the best life possible. They call her like the miracle baby. And she eventually gets into Harvard. And I don't want to give too much of the story away, but it's beautifully written. I can't recommend it enough. And she reads the audiobook herself. And in the interview we just had with her, she says that that's the best way to consume this book because sentences hit, the way she wants them to land. So I would go get this audiobook immediately if I were you.
Yes, and be sure to listen for that interview. I'm so excited for you all to hear this conversation.
Yeah. What are you reading and enjoying right now?
Well, funnily enough, this upcoming episode that we're teasing is actually with two authors. We also got to chat with the amazing Aaliyah Bilal, whose debut novel, Temple Folk, is absolutely incredible.
I like that you're holding the book up.
I'm holding it up for your eyes only.
Yes.
So Temple Folk is Aaliyah's debut. I think I just said that, but I can't hype that fact enough. The story about how she came to have this book published is incredible. It's a collection of 10 short stories about the Black Muslim community in America. And I mean, you can even just look at the blurbs on the back of this book and know that you are in for some absolutely stunning writing. And getting to talk to Aaliyah about this was such a treat. She is so just incredibly eloquent and passionate about the work that she does. So, Temple Folk, check it out.
Amazing. I am checking it out because I also am holding it up and reading it.
It's on your desk too.
Yes. Two amazing, amazing books. So go get those immediately. And those episodes will be coming out soon. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast. If you already subscribed, please rate the podcast. And
just as a reminder, if you are not yet a Libro FM member, you can subscribe now and use the promo code SWITCH, and you'll get 3 audiobooks for your first month of membership instead of just 1. So you could get Temple Folk, you could get Catalina, and a 3rd book, perhaps one of those books recommended by our guests on the podcast.
And as always, thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to Book to the Bookstore Education Podcast, brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA website at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!